Broadcasting from the Cass Corridor in Detroit, this is The Metro, a slice of news, culture, and conversation. I'm Robyn Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Today on the program, a community center is opening in Southwest Detroit. We'll learn about the essential services it's bringing to the neighborhood.
Plus, federal cuts are hitting veterans especially hard. That's making state funds for veterans more essential, but some of those funds could be in jeopardy too.
Also, we revisit how chronic absenteeism is affecting Detroit kids and why the issue is so complex. And Robyn, also on the topic of education, President Trump has been making good on his campaign promise to dismantle the Department of Education. Last week, he signed an executive order directing the Education Secretary to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return authority over education to states and local communities. Now, to be clear, states and local communities already largely control education in the U.S., but conservative activists have long opposed the department and its role as civil rights watchdog. Trump has blamed the department for lagging student achievement. He argues it is part of a bloated federal system that must be eliminated. One of the department's key roles is distributing funds to many low-income districts. That includes Detroit Public Schools Community District. 1/3 of its funding for Detroit schools comes from the Department of Education. Trump claims low-income districts like Detroit will still have access to this crucial funding, but school officials remain concerned. Nikolai Vitti is one of them. He's the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools Community District. He sat down with Robyn to discuss how dismantling of the Department of Education could affect Detroit kids. He began by discussing one of the most pressing issues facing Detroit schools, a lack of funding, and why federal money is so vital for Detroit schools.
The first challenge with funding is the way the Michigan formula works. So all districts in Michigan are required to tax at 18 mills in order to receive state aid, which is just state funding for K-12. If you generate less than now $9,600 per student, the state makes up the difference to make sure you're at a minimum $9,600. DPSCD, when we tax, our tax base is low, so we don't generate $9,600, but the state does make up the difference. One advantage that suburban, wealthier districts have that surround Detroit is they have this local funding, which drives the majority of their budget, and it's completely fungible, flexible, so they can put in teacher salaries and facilities. And this is our challenge in Detroit, in that we don't have money for facility upgrades. We don't have the same kind of money to increase teacher salaries at the rate of these suburban districts. We made huge strides in teacher salaries, but we can't get to where these suburban districts are with the most veteran teachers because of this funding difference. So with that said, we talk about federal funding. So DPSCD receives about 30% of their overall budget is federal. That is all supplemental. And what the average Michigander doesn't understand is that those federal dollars cannot be used the same way the state dollars can be used. So I can't use 1 penny of federal money for teacher salaries. I can't use 1 penny of federal dollars to pay for new roofs or roof repairs or to build a new school. We heavily rely on federal funding to do things a bit differently in our budget to support children that are growing up in concentrated poverty, and Detroit leads the country in the percentage of students and people in concentrated poverty.
What you're saying here is the federal funding that Detroit schools receives is highly restricted in the ways in which you can use it. I want to talk a little bit more about the ways that you are using it. We know that low-income kids, students with disabilities, and English language learners will be hit especially hard by cuts to the Department of Education. And you have a lot of students in Detroit Public Schools who fall under these categories.
Yeah, so when we look at federal funding and how we use it, again, cannot be used the same way you use the state funding. So we fund guidance counselors. We fund attendance agents that work with families and do home visits to make sure that kids are coming to school. We fund our academic interventionists, many of them which are college-degreed individuals that work with students one-on-one, small group in literacy and math to improve their performance, which has improved since the pandemic and before the pandemic at a faster rate than the state of Michigan has improved. We're at our highest levels in literacy and math because of the work that the interventionists perform. We fund our music and art teachers out of federal programs. We fund our after-school programming, course recovery to make sure that high school students graduate in 4 years. We fund our robotics programs, our chess programs. I think I named our field trips earlier. A lot of our technology initiatives are linked to federal funding. So when you ask how many kids would be impacted by these cuts, all of them. Because we have such concentrated poverty in the city and all of our schools, for the most part, are Title I schools, all students benefit from federal programming in one way or the other. And so does our staff through things like professional development and training. So this talk of reducing federal funding is going to have an impact on all of our schools and all of our children and all of our staff in a direct, indirect way.
Dr. Vitti, your school budget for this coming fall has to be finalized by the end of June. Just last week, President Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. How is this affecting the way that your budget committee is operating right now? Is everyone scrambling? What kinds of hard decisions are you facing now?
Well, I've used having lived through a pandemic and been a superintendent in the pandemic, it was just completely chaotic and unnerving to figure out all these new challenges and how to overcome them. I think that this administration has created a man-made or federal government-made pandemic-like chaos and disruption. There are significantly more questions and answers, very little guidance about the direction of the federal government. So let's break this down, for example. As you mentioned, our budget has to be adopted by June. We have a state budget that usually is not adopted by June, but we get enough sense of roughly where it will be based on the governor, Senate, House proposals, and we sort of take an average of those three and get a sense of where things will land, and we adopt that. Generally, not perfect, but fairly, we get it done fairly accurately, and then we can do a budget amendment after the fall count to reconcile any differences between the adopted budget and then the updated budget. But federally, over several years, we have not had significant changes in the federal funding. So the federal government doesn't have to adopt their budget until October. So you can imagine the kind of anxiety that we're going through and just disruption and thinking, okay, we got to balance this budget 30% based on federal funds in June, and we may not know that there are cuts and the extent of cuts until October. So you're going to imagine the chaos that can ensue with school starting for us in August, and then 50,000 kids coming to school, thousands of employees coming to school, and then we are officially told in October that the federal budget is being cut by 25%. Maybe all of Title II is cut, which supports training, or Title III that supports English language learners. And we're going to have to scramble to adopt a new budget after the fall count with those cuts in mind. Now, we're developing contingency plans where we'll use our fund balance fund balance is money that is basically our savings account, our rainy day fund to fill a gap. That may be only filled for a couple months, maybe a year, depending on the extent of cuts. And so that's the chaos that I'm referring to and the disruption that I'm referring to, because our goal is to protect student achievement, to protect the classroom, keep people employed because they serve our children, and probably fill the gap through our fund balance. We're also going to rely heavily on the state. We've been already advocating through the governor's office, mainly through the Senate. The House is not as sympathetic right now with Republican leadership on maybe creating some kind of emergency funds, 1 year, 2 year, one-time money loan type of situation to avoid massive cuts to student programming and to staffing based on what's coming from the federal government.
Dr. Vitti, I want to stay on the topic of state policy. I'm wondering if you think Governor Whitmer's proposed education budget for Michigan students is enough. I mean, she's proposing a 4% increase to the amount of per pupil funding. That would raise that funding from $9,600 per student to $10,000. doesn't seem like that's going to be a very substantial or impactful increase, even if it's passed.
No. Well, yeah, and you sort of mentioned it in your question. I don't think her budget as proposed will be passed because the House budget, a House controlled by the Republicans, is dramatically different. So her proposal is a strong incremental improvement and increase in per pupil funding, and there's other strong elements of it. We're largely supportive of it. But in light of the federal cuts that are looming, it won't do much to fill the gap that will be created by the federal cuts. So this is why we're starting to advocate for the state budget to rely on its surplus to maybe give districts one-time money to possibly fill the gap here. I'm optimistic that the governor will do that as well as the Senate. We'll see where the House is. I think what's very concerning when we talk about the state budget, to shift a minute, is the House budget is interesting because the headlines might be that per pupil funding is increasing over $10,000 and a bit higher than even the governor's recommendation. But the devil's always in the details, and the devil here is the complete elimination of at-risk funding. So the House proposal, the state level, mirrors the federal budget in that it cuts 25% of overall K-12 funding in the state of Michigan, but that's hidden because the per pupil funding is increasing, but it completely eliminates at-risk money. And at-risk is, again, targeting issues of poverty, special needs, English language learners. And for us, it's $60 million. So if we cut federally large amounts, 25%, which would be anywhere from maybe 30 to 60 million, cut at risk, another 60 million. Again, huge gaps and holes in our budget. And let me clarify, even with that 60 million of at-risk money that DPSCD receives, it doesn't even get close to the per pupil amount that's naturally generated at the local level with wealthy suburban districts surrounding the district.
I think this is going to make some people very angry to hear this because it sounds like Michigan is going on a potential path that would deprioritize education, especially for the state's most vulnerable students.
Well, absolutely. And I think what's frustrating is the messaging coming out of Washington. So, as you abolish or plan to and work with Congress to abolish the Department of Education, I'll be honest, and my colleagues aren't completely on the same page with me, we don't really feel the day-to-day impact of the Department of Education at the federal level as we run districts and we run schools. That's just a fact. But the reality is that by abolishing the Department of Education, you are reducing the oversight, accountability of civil rights requirements linked to issues of race, language, gender. And I think that's needed for the protection of staff, for children and families. And that will all move to the states. There's already been staff cuts at the federal level around student loans, research and development when it comes to education. So that's overall concerning, but that's not really going to affect the day-to-day operations of different schools. What's really frustrating right now is that President Trump is talking about and clearly said, well, if the department goes away, the funding isn't going to change. It'll go to other agencies. But there are facts that contradict that. What are those facts? Congress has already agreed to cut $2 trillion of overall federal funding, and K-12 education represents anywhere from 5 to 10% of funding. So it's hard to imagine a $2 trillion cut that's not going to go into education. We know executive orders have been released about using federal funds to initiate choice processes, voucher-like systems, and we know Project 2025, which has been the blueprint of this administration, despite saying otherwise during the campaign. Project 2025 calls for the eventual elimination of Title I funding. And so I'm sounding the alarm now without specificity because we already see a track record of saying one thing and doing something else and relying on the Project 2025 as a blueprint to different reforms at the federal level.
So the Trump administration has claimed that dismantling the Department of Education is a move that will allow for local control of education. And I do want to reiterate what you're saying here, which is that we know most education is already controlled at the local and state level. And you're saying that your concern now is that what is going to happen with its dismantling is just, and this is something I've heard from many education advocates, it's going to mean less oversight, particularly when it comes to civil rights issues. Can you say any more about what you think is behind these moves by the Trump administration?
Yeah, these are largely ideological, red meat type of politics that get into the difficulty of talking about race and even class and poverty in this country. That's what's driving this. It's not a thoughtful, strategic way to improve public institutions, in this case, public education. Everyone will agree that public education needs to improve. Having run public school systems as a teacher, dean, principal, superintendent, I will tell you that there's a beauty in the beast that comes with public institutions and public education. But what keeps me doing this work is the beauty and the potential and the opportunity that the public institution offers, which is the vehicle for social change and an opportunity to get out of the cycle of poverty. And that has worked and happened for thousands, millions of citizens in this country. But we politicize it by talking about when it fails rather than committed to improving it. And that comes with more resources and more accountability. And right now, the Trump administration is not focused on improving the institution. It's more focused on disinvesting and defunding it, which is only going to lead to more chaos, more failure, and more frustration in communities that are largely communities of color and communities that are struggling with economic issues, regardless of race in this country. There's no vision for how we're going to build up and improve. And just simply saying, well, the states are going to figure it out. Look at our state. We're struggling with equitable and equal funding. We're struggling with the right accountability systems to hold schools and districts accountable. So the vision of just giving it to the states and local governments is not necessarily the solution.
But then when we hear from certain Republicans, they would say public education isn't under attack. The Department of Education is something that should have been abolished long ago. I mean, certainly there have been many opponents to it since it was created back in 1979. Do you see any benefits to abolishing it?
I mean, I always will answer the question honestly and directly, whether people like that or not. As a sitting superintendent now in two large urban school districts for over 10 years, I can't tell you that the federal government has necessarily helped our work. Under the Bush administration, going back to the early 2000s, I was largely supportive of No Child Left Behind. I think that there were things I had problems with, but I did believe that our school systems needed more accountability. That obviously came through the Department of Education. I think No Child Left Behind had mixed results. I think what the Obama administration did better than the Bush administration is they carried on the focus on accountability, but offered more resources and funding. And when I was in Miami, we used that well. And, we won the Broad Prize for Excellence in Urban Education because there was a good balance of accountability and extra resources. And then the latter part of the Obama administration started to walk away from strong reform and resources in the K-12 space. The first Trump administration was hands-off. The Biden administration was largely hands-off. The second Trump administration is just backing completely out of a federal government's role. So to answer your question, the elimination of the department in and of itself does not necessarily trouble me, honestly, as a long-term public school practitioner. What's concerning me about where this administration is going from a public education point of view is what I find in all Americans, Republican, Democrat, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, is that everyone believes in the potential of children. I've never met someone who doesn't believe in the potential of children. I also never met someone that doesn't believe that someone's zip code should determine their outcomes. What we're seeing right now and where we're headed is a federal policy and funding structure that's going to defund the system that we rely on to lift children up. And the president, Congress needs to be held accountable to what's being said right now. Well, we're going to dismantle the department, but funding is going to stay the same. That's on record. And so this administration needs to be held accountable to that, because if they're not, we're going to see the continuing erosion of equal opportunities in this country, because that happens through the public school systems. And we're going to lose our footing in this country, and we already have, but it's going to be worsened over the next couple of years if we continue down this trend.
That was Nikolai Vitti, Superintendent of Detroit Public Schools Community District. He was discussing the dismantling of the Department of Education and what it could mean for students in Detroit and beyond.
This is the Metro. From the WDET newsroom, the State House passed parts of a Republican-led education plan last week. The bills would require school districts to post links to performance data on their websites and allow high schoolers to dual enroll at trade schools, not just colleges and universities. Speaker Matt Hall says the legislation is a step forward for education. The state already has a website where parents can track and compare school data, but Hall doesn't believe it's accessible enough. Democrats voted for parts of the legislation, but called other bills redundant or incomplete. Coming up at 11, you can't learn if you aren't in school. We'll stay on education and return to the topic of chronic absenteeism in Detroit and beyond. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us.